In the year 1884, in a quiet town nestled along the edges of the Hudson River, a curious and unsettling discovery was made within the confines of a decaying mansion that had long been abandoned by its inhabitants. Hidden deep within the walls of the family study, a ledger was uncovered, its cover worn and cracked, the edges frayed from decades of neglect. The pages inside, however, were far more telling than the book itself. Some were torn, others nearly illegible, stained with ink that had long since bled into the fibres of the paper. Yet it was not the condition of the ledger that drew attention, but what had been written within it, fragmented entries, half-sentences, and fragmented thoughts, written with a haste that suggested the writer had been desperate to document something before it slipped beyond their grasp. Among the strange words and symbols, one phrase stood out, repeated several times. "The voices are real. They will come for us." The ledger, sealed and misfiled away for generations, was never meant to be found. In the years that followed its discovery, many tried to piece together its meaning. Who had written it? Why had it been hidden? What had been left unsaid, witnessed but never spoken of? As investigators sifted through the remnants of the family's past, they found more questions than answers. An old photograph, marked but never mailed, showed the family standing together in front of the house, their expressions unreadable, their eyes strangely vacant. A letter sealed but unopened lay beside it, containing no return address, only a single word scribbled on the front: "Help." It was dated, but unsigned. This discovery was only the beginning. Over the following months, evidence of a slow unraveling began to emerge, detailing an obsession that grew, a darkness that lingered, and a house that held more than its fair share of secrets. The whispers that had plagued the family for years seemed to have originated from something deeper, something older than the house itself. Yet their source was never fully understood. Before we delve deeper into the horrors of this family's decline, consider this. What could have been so unsettling that it compelled a family to hide their own records, to abandon their home, and to disappear into the shadow of their own fears? What could drive a man, a father, to leave behind only cryptic remnants of a truth that would remain, sealed for generations? If you're curious to uncover more of this mystery, subscribe to Gothic Ledger. Let us know where you're watching from, what time it is, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Stay with us as we uncover the hidden truths that time has tried to bury. The letter was discovered in a small, forgotten drawer beneath the family patriarch's desk, tucked beneath a stack of papers that had been left untouched for months. The faint scent of old ink lingered on the paper, the words carefully inscribed in a hand that trembled as it wrote. It was dated just days before the family's untimely demise, when the house, which had once been full of laughter and life, had grown disturbingly silent. As it was unfolded, the paper crinkled, as if reluctant to be disturbed. The words were not hurried but deliberate, though the writing had grown less steady in the final lines. The letter spoke of dread, of an unease that had settled in every corner of the house. The patriarch, once a man of clear mind and even disposition, now seemed to find himself in the grip of something darker. The letter did not speak of specific events or occurrences, only impressions, strange whispers that seemed to seep from the walls, voices that were not his own, murmuring in a language he could not understand. Yet somehow he understood them. There was no mention of who, if anyone, had spoken to him. The words that filled his mind and his nights seemed to come from the very wood of the house itself, or perhaps from something far older. He described them as quiet at first, faint, like the echo of a distant conversation heard through a closed door. Then the whispers grew louder, pressing in from all sides. The family, he wrote, had begun to notice them too, and once they did, the silence between them seemed to stretch into something oppressive, unbearable. His wife, once the calm center of their home, had stopped answering him, her gaze fixed on the corners of their rooms as though something stood just beyond her line of sight. The patriarch's thoughts wandered, not fully grounded in what had happened, but rather in what he feared would happen. His mind seemed to circle the same dark notions, the same impossible conclusions. The walls themselves had become sentient, aware, watching them, listening. The more he wrote, the more his sentences fractured. "I cannot tell if the voices are real," he wrote in a final shaky hand, "or if it is only the house that speaks." The letter was sealed with an unusual wax, an odd, dull red hue, unlike any the family had used before. The insignia that marked the seal was unfamiliar, a symbol that seemed to shift, like the jagged edges of a broken mirror. There were no immediate answers, only a sense that the house, like the minds of its inhabitants, had slowly begun to unravel. The patriarch had begged for someone, anyone, to come to the house, though he did not explicitly say who. He spoke of an overwhelming sense of suffocation, as though they were all living in a place where the air was growing thin, where the ground itself seemed to shift beneath them. Yet no one had arrived. No help had come. As the letter came to its conclusion, there was no hope left in the words. There was only the unsettling final line. "It is too late for me now. It will be too late for all of us." His handwriting trailed off after that, as if he could no longer hold the pen steady, or perhaps had simply lost the will to continue. The letter was all that was left, but even it felt incomplete, as though it too had been interrupted. There was nothing to suggest what had happened in those final days. The house had not given up its secrets, and the patriarch's fate was as unknowable as the words he left behind. But the whispers lingered, if only in the silence that now filled the room. The neighbors of the Harrington family first began to notice the oddities in the early spring, when the weather grew warmer, but the house did not seem to respond to the change. Though the windows were often closed tightly, there was an undeniable sense of something being kept inside. For months they observed the growing isolation of the family. Visitors ceased, and the family's presence within their home became more erratic, as though the very act of moving from room to room was conducted in a state of constant unease. It was during these months that the whispers began. Faint at first, so faint that some claimed it was merely the wind, no one could quite place their origin. At night, as the family sat in the dim glow of their lamps, the whispers became more pronounced. Neighbors standing just outside their own homes would often hear them, as though the walls themselves carried the sound, stretching it thin and cold through the darkness. Those closest to the house swore that the voices grew louder with each passing night. They seemed to emanate from the family's study, once a room of order and discipline, now consumed by an oppressive quiet that barely masked the strange conversations unfolding inside. Servants in the household, too, began to act out of sorts. They spoke of being drawn to certain parts of the house, as though compelled by forces they could not understand. One housekeeper, a young woman with a gentle disposition, began to weep without explanation. She spoke of hearing them at night, and of seeing the family members in the drawing-room, sitting still, their mouths moving, but no sounds reaching her. She was certain the family was not speaking to each other. It was as if they were answering someone, or something, that she could not hear. As the days passed, these whispers became more frantic, more insistent. The family's behavior grew erratic. The patriarch, as once a commanding figure, now spent hours pacing the floors at night, his face gaunt and eyes wide, as though searching for something in the shadows. His wife, who had once been the anchor of the household, now rarely left her room, often seen staring at nothing, her lips moving in whispered conversation with an invisible presence. The children, once lively and curious, became withdrawn. They were observed staring at the walls for long periods, their eyes fixed, their hands twitching in nervous agitation. One neighbor, who had stood by the gate, recalled hearing the sounds of what seemed to be an argument one night, sharp words, quick breaths, and then a sudden silence. The quiet was almost suffocating. Another neighbor, a woman who had lived on the street for decades, began to notice the strange patterns in the family's movements. Every time she looked toward the house, the curtains in the study would shift, and she would catch glimpses of someone. No, not someone, but the outline of a figure, just beyond the window, watching her in return. Still, there were no signs of external disturbance. No one arrived at the house, and no one left, save for the servants who came and went. The family's isolation became so complete that the house itself seemed to hold its breath. The whispers continued, though now they were unmistakably growing in volume, filling the spaces between the rooms like the murmur of a distant crowd, or perhaps something far worse, a presence that could not be named. No one ever spoke of the exact nature of the voices. It was simply known that the family was not alone, even when the house was still, and though no one could see it, there was a sense that something unseen was moving within the walls, its presence felt in every corner, in every creak of the floorboards. There was no explanation for it, only the growing certainty among the few who dared to speak of it that the family had become prisoners of the house itself, held captive by something far beyond their control. The house, a grand Victorian structure, stood at the very edge of the city, its towering spires cutting against the sky like dark fingers reaching for an unreachable heaven. Once it had been a symbol of wealth, refinement, and prosperity. Visitors, when the house was still alive with activity, had marveled at its high ceilings, the ornate woodwork, the sprawling staircases that seemed to lead to a different world. But that was years ago, before the whispers had begun, before the slow unraveling of everything that had once been whole. Over time, the house seemed to pull away from the city around it, growing more isolated, more withdrawn. Its once vibrant exterior began to fade, the paint peeling in strips, the windows coated with grime and dust. The imposing stonework that had once gleamed in the sunlight now absorbed the light, casting the house in perpetual shadow. The air, thick and still, held a peculiar coldness. It was not the chill of winter, nor the coolness of a neglected hearth. It was a steady, suffocating cold, one that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. No matter the season, no matter how many fires were lit in the hearth, the house remained frozen, unyielding. The windows, once wide and welcoming, were sealed shut. Heavy curtains were drawn across them, hiding whatever might have been beyond. From the outside the house seemed closed off, as though it no longer wished to engage with the world. But inside, the space was vast, its rooms stretching far beyond what any visitor could fathom. It was not just the decay of the building that disturbed those who came to call, but the sense of something more. The air itself seemed to hold a weight, as though the house carried the burden of time too heavily. Those who were permitted inside described the unsettling silence that greeted them. The halls, though once filled with the sounds of lively conversation, now echoed only with their own footsteps, each one sounding too loud, too intrusive. The rooms were abandoned, and yet there was always the feeling that someone, something, was watching. The rooms themselves, though never physically altered, seemed to shift in their mood, their very atmosphere thickening with an oppressive quiet. The family's quarters, once carefully arranged and warm with the comfort of domestic life, now stood in stark contrast. The doors were bolted shut, and the walls, though they bore the weight of so many years, seemed to lean inwards, closing the rooms off from the outside world. It was said that no one ventured into the upper floors anymore, and that when the family was questioned about the upper hallways, their responses were always vague, disjointed. Perhaps the most chilling observation, however, was the feeling of being enclosed in a space that was both alive and dead at once. The air in the house was always thick with a strange pressure, a dissonance that hung in the quiet corners of each room. Visitors who lingered too long would often remark upon the sensation of being in the presence of something intangible, something that had not yet fully let go of its past, but had already begun to die. The sense of unease was not immediate, but slow, creeping in like the tide, so that by the time it had reached its peak, no one in the house seemed to notice it any more. The house had simply become a part of them, and they a part of it. No one spoke of it openly, but the house, in its silence, had begun to feel like a living thing, a thing that had become heavy with its own secrets, pressing down on those who remained within its walls, forcing them into a quiet, ever-tightening embrace. And in the stillness of the rooms the whispers grew louder, impossible to ignore. Over the span of several months, the once vibrant family gradually withered, both in body and spirit. The transformation was subtle at first, an unnoticed slackening of vitality, but soon it became impossible to ignore. The patriarch, whose face had once been firm and resolute, grew increasingly hollow. His cheeks, once full, sank into sharp contours, and the healthy glow of his skin turned a sickly pallor, as though the very life was draining from him. His eyes, once bright and discerning, became hollow, darkened beneath the lids, as though he had not slept in weeks. His voice, which had once commanded attention in every room, now trembled when he spoke, as though the weight of his own words pressed down too heavily on him. The matriarch, too, was not spared. Where there had once been the soft roundness of a woman who had borne children and guided a home with gentle authority, there was now only an almost skeletal figure. Her movements became slow, deliberate, as if each step were a burden. She no longer rose with the sun. Her presence, which had once been warm, was now cold, remote, as though she inhabited a space just beyond reach. Her eyes no longer lingered on her children or her husband, but rather drifted off into nothingness, her face often frozen in a vacant stare. Their children, once lively and curious, became increasingly withdrawn. Their cheeks, too, grew hollow, their bodies too frail for their age, as though their vitality had been siphoned away in the night. The younger child, a boy, had stopped speaking altogether. His lips rarely moved, and his eyes were wide, as though he were seeing something others could not. The girl, older and once full of energy, would sit for hours, staring at the walls, her hands trembling in her lap. She would not speak to anyone outside the family, her voice only ever heard in low murmurs, her words indistinct, as if they were meant for someone unseen. The family's decline was not limited to their physical appearance. There was a growing unease that clung to the house, a tension in the air that no amount of firewood could dispel. The voices, the whispers, grew louder. At first they had been soft, like the rustling of leaves in a far-off field. But now they were insistent, sharp, cutting through the silence like the flicker of a candle flame in the dark. The family began to fear each other. The father would stand by the door to his wife's room, listening intently, his brow furrowed in confusion. He would murmur under his breath, as though responding to something unseen, though no one was there to hear. The children, once open and affectionate, recoiled from anyone who came near them. They would retreat into their rooms, their bodies pressed tightly against the walls, their eyes darting to the corners of their rooms, as though something lurked just out of sight. Their voices, though no longer heard by outsiders, seemed to echo within their minds, fragmented conversations in an unknown tongue, indistinct but undeniable. Outside the house the world continued, but within its walls a slow, suffocating stillness took hold. No one came to visit any more. No one spoke of them. The house, once a place of warmth and laughter, had become a tomb, its inhabitants trapped in a perpetual state of fear and obsession. They no longer looked at each other as family, but as strangers, strangers bound together by an invisible force, one that whispered its commands in the dark, guiding them to a fate no one could foresee. By the time the last remnants of their former selves remained, the house had taken on a new character. It was no longer just a home, but an anchor, binding the family to something darker, something unseen. The whispers, once faint, had grown so loud that they drowned out all other sound. Randomly in their growing madness they had begun to answer. The letter arrived on a quiet morning in late autumn, sealed with the physician's personal insignia, though the parchment inside held little of the certainty one would expect from a trained doctor. Dr. Richards, the family's personal physician, had attended to them for years. His name had been synonymous with care and professionalism, and he was known for his unwavering composure. Yet, within the lines of this letter, his hand trembled. It was an unusual thing to witness, especially for a man who had prided himself on his calmness, but it was clear the situation had taken a turn from which he could not return. He wrote of his growing concern over the family's health, both mental and physical. The first symptoms had appeared subtly, with only minor complaints of fatigue and irritability. But soon they became more pronounced. Sleepless nights had turned into endless days of silence, and those same nights were filled with whispers that seemed to come from within the very walls of the house. He had initially dismissed them as products of the mind, fatigue-induced delusions, but as time passed, his concern grew. The physical symptoms were no less troubling. The family, once in good health, had begun to deteriorate rapidly. Their faces grew gaunt, their bodies weak, and yet their appetites had not changed. They no longer seemed to care for sustenance in the way they once had. No matter how much food was brought to the table, it remained untouched. They grew thinner, their bones protruding beneath their skin, their voices hoarse, but growing louder in the silence. The most unsettling aspect, Dr. Richards noted, was that despite these symptoms, there was no clear physical cause. His examinations revealed nothing conclusive. Their hearts beat steadily, their lungs clear, but something deeper, something psychological, was consuming them from the inside out. The family's condition had progressed, and now, Dr. Richards wrote, they no longer interacted with one another in the way one would expect a family to. The children, once lively and playful, now stared into space for hours, as though lost in a world only they could see. The father, who had always been a man of reason, began to speak in a low, mumbling tone to himself, words no one could understand. The mother, ever the caretaker, had stopped speaking entirely, instead retreating to her room, eyes vacant as she seemed to listen to something only she could hear. I fear, Dr. Richards wrote, that a sickness of the mind is consuming them, one that is both inside and outside their bodies. The whispers, though faint, are real. I have heard them myself. The letter begged for help, for an investigation into what might be causing such a rapid mental collapse. He feared a mass psychosis, something unknown and far beyond his ability to treat. He had exhausted every possible solution, tried every remedy within his grasp, but the family only grew worse. However, despite the urgency of his request, the letter never reached its intended destination. Whether through misfortune or some darker force, the letter was delayed, misplaced perhaps, or simply lost in transit. By the time it would have been received, the family's condition had deteriorated beyond repair. The voices had taken them, and they would not be freed. What had begun as a call for help now seemed like a futile cry into the void. The letter itself, silent and waiting for someone to listen, remained unanswered, just as the house itself had begun to echo with the hollow whispers of its inhabitants, trapped within its walls. The house had long been sealed, its walls holding the secrets of a family that had crumbled into madness. Yet among the wreckage of the once proud estate, one servant had been found alive. She was discovered in the farthest corner of the kitchen, her body trembling, but otherwise unharmed. Her clothes were dishevelled, her face pale, eyes wide with a kind of terror that had not yet faded. She was the only one to survive the silent disaster that had unfolded within those walls, yet she was as much a prisoner of it as the family who had perished. When the authorities arrived, they found her sitting motionless on the floor, staring blankly at the peeling walls. The house, now abandoned, had grown colder still, and the air was thick with the weight of a lingering presence. The servant was unresponsive to the touch of those who tried to comfort her, to the voices that called out her name. She only looked, her gaze unblinking, at the walls, her breath shallow and strained. Attempts to coax her into speech were met with silence. She refused to speak of the events that transpired, refused even to acknowledge them, as though by not speaking she could distance herself from the horrors that had filled the house. It was not that she had no voice, it was that she had chosen not to use it. Her silence was unnerving, more so than any words could have been. It was as though the very act of speaking would shatter her fragile grip on reality. Those who cared for her in the weeks that followed could see that something had shifted within her. She no longer moved with the grace of a servant accustomed to her duties. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as though she were forever listening for something that could not be named. At night, she would stand by the walls of the house, her head tilted slightly, as if hearing something just beyond the threshold of sound. Her wide eyes would flicker too, or the corners of the room as though following unseen movements. Occasionally her hands would twitch, as if to reach out for something or someone that was not there. It was always the same, a look of yearning that never found its target. Her mouth, when it opened, produced nothing but the softest of whispers, a sound barely audible to the ear. Yet when asked about it, she would simply stare into the space before her, her gaze unbroken, as though the question had not been spoken at all. The investigators who came to the house could find no explanation for her condition. There were no wounds on her body, no signs of physical abuse. She had been untouched by the violence that had claimed the others. Yet she was not the same as she had been. Her spirit seemed to have fled, leaving behind only the shell of the woman who had once served the family. In place of the servant who had moved with purpose was a figure who had become part of the house itself, one who was caught in its quiet, oppressive grip. Days turned into weeks, and her silence only deepened. The house, once a place of opulence, now felt like a tomb, and the servant, though alive, seemed to be the last lingering echo of the family that had once lived there. No one ever learned what she had seen or heard in those final days. And as the walls of the house continued to decay, her unspoken knowledge remained locked away, sealed in the silence of her wide-eyed gaze. She was never able to leave the house. Perhaps in the end she did not wish to. The investigation began with an unease that no one could quite explain. At first the sounds were merely whispers, indistinct murmurs that seemed to rise from the very bones of the house itself. They had been dismissed as nothing more than the creaking of old timbers or the shifting of the foundation. But as the days passed, those sounds grew. At night they became harder to ignore, echoing through the hollow spaces between the walls, as if something or someone was speaking from within. It was the study that drew the attention of the investigators. The room, once filled with books and artifacts, now sat in an unnatural silence. The walls, which had once seemed solid and reassuring, now seemed thin and fragile, as if they were the only things holding back whatever force had begun to stir. The investigators, experienced men accustomed to strange noises in ancient buildings, found themselves unnerved. The sounds seemed to originate from the very structure, as if the house itself was trying to communicate. The first time they heard it clearly, they had been standing in the study, trying to piece together the fragmented history of the family. The air was thick with dust, and the weight of years seemed to hang over them. Then it came, faint at first, like a whisper just on the edge of hearing. At first the investigators turned to each other, exchanging uncertain glances. It was nothing, they thought, just the wind or the house settling. But then it came again, clearer this time. A voice, though soft, distinct enough to be unsettling. "Not yet," it whispered, as though it had been waiting for them. The men froze, their eyes searching the room, but there was nothing to see. The windows were shut tight, and no one else was present. The house, always cold, seemed to grow colder still, and the voice echoed again, as though it had been pulled from the very air around them. The inn. Investigators were drawn to the walls, their fingers tracing the worn wallpaper as they pressed their ears to the surface. What they heard was not a single voice, but many, layered over one another in a disturbing harmony. They could not make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, an insistent, almost pleading quality to the murmur, as though the walls themselves were trying to communicate a hidden truth, one that had been buried long ago. The men speculated quietly, their voices low, as though speaking too loudly would provoke something worse. Could the house be a conduit? Was it possible that the voices had seeped into the structure itself, imbued with a malevolent presence? They had seen nothing, no physical manifestation of the voices, but the growing certainty in their minds was palpable. The house, they whispered, might have been the very source of the family's descent into madness. Could it have been drawing them in, slowly, over time, feeding on their fear, their isolation? As the investigation continued, the voices only grew louder, more distinct. The investigators, though trying to remain composed, began to find themselves drawn into the same unsettling rhythm. They began to hear things that weren't there, to feel the pull of the voices, as though they too were being consumed by the house. Days passed, and the house seemed to grow more alive, more insistent, its whispers filling the silence, wrapping around them like a shroud. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the voices stopped. The walls were silent. But in that silence, the investigators were left with a single, unresolved question. What had they awakened, and what had they missed in the quiet that now filled the house? The journal was found amidst a clutter of forgotten papers, tucked beneath a pile of books in the patriarch's study. It had been left incomplete, the last page filled with a single erratic scrawl. The ink had long since begun to fade, the words trembling on the edge of clarity, as though the hand that had written them had grown too weary to continue. The entries began in a manner most would expect, a man of reason documenting his concerns with the disquiet of his home. The patriarch's first words were measured, describing the faintest whisperings that seemed to follow him wherever he went. At first he attributed it to stress, to the pressure of family matters and an overactive imagination. "I am simply overtired," he wrote, "and I must admit that my nerves are not what they once were." He blamed his workload, the growing isolation of his family, and the unnatural stillness of the house. The whispers, he noted, began faintly at night, when the house was quiet. He described them as distant murmurs, so faint that he could not be sure if they were real or simply his mind playing tricks on him. For a time he ignored them, dismissing them as the imaginings of a tired man. But soon the voices began to grow, and with their growth his grip on reality began to loosen. In his later entries the words began to shift in tone. There was a growing sense of urgency in the way he wrote. The whispers, once barely perceptible, had now become clearer, though still elusive. They seemed to echo through the walls, fading in and out like the sound of distant conversations, always just out of reach. He began to record his thoughts more erratically, as though trying to make sense of something he could no longer understand. He would write one sentence, then quickly strike it out, replacing it with another, more desperate attempt at explanation. I hear them all," he wrote once. Night. His handwriting slanted, as though he could not keep the words steady. And now I hear my own thoughts answered in whispers. I am not mad. They are real. The handwriting grew more disjointed with each passing day. His entries became filled with confusion, a disintegration of thought. The paranoia was creeping in. He could feel it. It was no longer just the voices. Now there was a constant sense of being watched, observed by something unseen. As the weeks passed, his entries grew increasingly fragmented, filled with cryptic notes and obsessive scribblings. His observations about the house became less about the rooms and more about the spaces in between, the spaces where the voices seemed to lurk. He began to believe that the house itself was alive, that it was somehow causing the voices, drawing them into the very walls. But then, in his last entry, the tone shifted entirely. His writing was jagged, the words barely legible, as though his hand had begun to lose control of the pen. "They have taken her voice," he wrote. "They will take mine next." The page ended abruptly, as though he had been interrupted, the words trailing off into the void. There was no explanation, no further attempt to rationalize the horror that had begun to consume him. The journal, once a place of methodical reflection, had become a testament to his slow descent into madness. The voices, once distant and faint, had consumed him entirely, and in the end they had taken his mind. The last page of the journal was never finished, leaving the true nature of his final thoughts lost in the silence that had overtaken him. His voice, once clear and commanding, had been replaced with the same whispers that had filled the house. And as the journal sat in the darkness, untouched, the house continued to listen. The final days of the family's life unfolded with a quiet terror, one that no one could fully comprehend or articulate. Their once vibrant home, now increasingly isolated from the world, became their prison. No visitors came, and none could penetrate the heavy silence that seemed to envelop the house. The family, already reduced by their physical decline and psychological unraveling, had withdrawn further into themselves. The house had grown colder, its rooms more barren, though the cold seemed to emanate from the very walls, not the winter air outside. In the final days, the house stood still. Its windows, once open to the world, were now shut tight, and the heavy curtains drew tight, as if blocking out not just light, but any chance of connection with the outside world. Neighbors whose concerns had long been growing began to notice the eerie stillness. They remarked that the house had no sounds, not even the quiet murmur of voices or the scuff of footsteps. It was as if the family had ceased to exist in any tangible form, as though they had become shadows, slipping unnoticed into the fabric of the house itself. On the morning of their deaths, the house was untouched by the usual bustle. There were no sounds from within, no laughter, no arguments, no idle conversations. The silence was oppressive, and the air thick with it. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen, though no one could say exactly what. The sense of foreboding grew heavier with each passing hour. The first to discover the family's fate was a servant, sent by a concerned neighbor to check on them. When she approached the door, she noticed it was ajar, an unusual occurrence for a house so meticulously sealed. She entered slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, and made her way into the study. It was there she found them, each of them, positioned in a manner that suggested no sound, struggle, but a profound stillness. The father sitting at his desk, his head tilted slightly, as though listening to something just beyond reach. His hand rested on the edge of the desk, a pen clutched in his fingers, but he was no longer writing. The mother was seated in the drawing-room, her posture unnaturally rigid. Her gaze was fixed on a spot in the far corner of the room, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as if waiting for a response that would never come. The children were gathered in the sitting room, their positions arranged almost too precisely, as if they had been carefully placed. Their faces, once full of life, were now pale and expressionless. Yet there was a strange stillness in their eyes, an empty focus on something unseen, a shared connection to something far beyond the realm of the living. The silence was deafening. No marks were found on their bodies, no signs of violence or external cause. The servants, upon entering the rooms, were too afraid to disturb the family's final repose. The coroner, when called to examine the bodies, was equally perplexed. There were no signs of poisoning, no marks of suffocation. The family appeared to have simply ceased to exist, as if they had been taken by something invisible, something that had consumed them from the inside. The final entry in the patriarch's journal remained unanswered. "They have taken her voice. They will take mine next." The house, now abandoned, stood silent once more. Its oppressive weight never lifted. The investigation yielded no answers, only more questions, questions that would never be fully answered, not by any document or testimony. And so the house remained, its walls keeping their secrets locked inside, its silence ever more haunting with each passing year. The study had long been a place of silence, its bookshelves lined with volumes that seemed untouched, gathering dust as though the family had never truly inhabited the space. The air inside was thick, heavy with the weight of forgotten time, and the lingering sense that something was not quite right. It was here that the investigators turned their attention, following the odd, nagging feeling that there was more to the house's mystery than had been revealed. It was one of the younger men, a newcomer to the investigation, who first noticed the faint outline in the wall, an imperceptible shift in the pattern of the woodwork, a small seam running along the panelling. At first he believed it to be nothing more than the natural expansion of old timber, but upon closer inspection it became evident that the wall had been disturbed, long ago perhaps, but disturbed nonetheless. Carefully, the panel was pried open, revealing a hidden compartment, sealed tight, its contents untouched by time yet ominously out of place. Inside, the investigators found a series of strange objects, none of which could be easily explained. There were torn fragments of letters, their edges frayed as though they had been hastily ripped from their original form, their ink faded and smeared. The words they contained were indecipherable, fragments of sentences that seemed to loop in on themselves, as though the writer was trying to communicate something only they understood. More unsettling, however, were the drawings. Several pieces of aged parchment were stuffed into the compartment, each one depicting human figures, tall, gaunt, with long, spindly limbs. But there was something horribly wrong with the faces. They were blank, featureless, as though the very concept of identity had been erased. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a void where human expression should have been. The figures seemed to stretch out, naturally, some with elongated torsos, others contorted in impossible positions, their limbs twisted in ways that should have been physically impossible. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was the manuscript. It was a bundle of pages, yellowed with age, bound together by what appeared to be an old string, now brittle and breaking. The pages were filled with cryptic phrases, the ink smudged in places, as though the writer had been interrupted midway. The words, though fragmented, seemed to repeat one common thread, a desperate plea to understand the voices. "The walls know," one phrase read, "and the faces will answer." Another, barely legible, spoke of opening the door and silencing the rest. The investigators recoiled from the manuscript as though it had become an object of terror, though none could explain why. They carefully examined each fragment, each drawing, but the implications were too vast, too unsettling. The family, once thought to have suffered from delusions, may have been involved in something much darker than mere paranoia. Had they uncovered something, some force, that drove them to madness? Or had they, perhaps, been participants in something far more sinister, a truth buried in the walls themselves. As the investigators stood in the study, the silence of the house pressed in on them, heavier than before. The voice, once faint, seemed to linger in the air, and the walls, once silent, now seemed to hum with a presence they could not name. The family's descent into madness had been more than a mere symptom of illness. It was as if they had been drawn toward something hidden and forgotten, lying dormant in the very structure that had once been their sanctuary. The compartment was resealed, but the sense of something unresolved, something still waiting, lingered in the room long after the investigators had left. The house, it seemed, had offered up only part of its secret. As the investigation into the Harrington family's tragic decline continued, the authorities turned their attention to the family's history. At first there had been little to suggest anything more than an isolated incident, a family undone by their own internal fractures. But as they sifted through records, interviews, and distant memories, they uncovered unsettling details, small threads that, when pulled, revealed something much darker. The family's history was not as pristine as it had once appeared. There were whispers of mental illness, dating back generations. Relatives, long forgotten or written off as eccentric, had suffered from similar symptoms: paranoia, hallucinations, and a pervasive sense of being watched. Those who had lived near them, when questioned, spoke of odd behaviors, frantic scribblings, eyes constantly scanning the room, hands trembling as though they were touching something no one else could see. It was not just the patriarch and his immediate family. These afflictions appeared to be woven into the fabric of their bloodline. Further inquiries into the family's lineage revealed a series of mental breakdowns stretching across generations. One ancestor, a great-grandfather, had been institutionalized for what was described as uncontrollable visions, claiming to hear voices that drove him to destructive fits. Another relative had died under mysterious circumstances in a remote cabin, their belongings found scattered, as though they had been in the midst of some frantic ritual. The authorities were left to wonder, was this simply a hereditary condition or something more insidious? Among the papers found in the patriarch's study was a family tree, meticulously drawn, with certain names marked in red ink. A few of the relatives had died young, others lived out their lives in secrecy. The most curious entry was that of a distant cousin who had mysteriously vanished several years prior. The only record of her death was a note, barely legible, found in the family ledger. She heard them too. What had been a vague reference in a list of names now seemed to echo with a new significance. The authorities began to speculate. The voices, which had so profoundly affected the family, may have been the result of some deeper, more malignant force. Could it have been passed down through the generations, an inherited madness? Or was there something more deliberate at play, an external influence that had slowly infiltrated their minds, gnawing at the edges of their sanity over time? It was hard to tell, as so many of the family's records were either incomplete or deliberately obscured. What was clear, however, was that their obsession with the voices had reached a critical point. The family, once capable of distinguishing reality from delusion, had lost that distinction entirely. The most troubling question of all, however, remained unanswered. Who were they speaking to? Why, in their final days, had they trusted these voices more than their own minds? It was as if the house, the walls themselves, had become a vessel for something otherworldly, something that manipulated them into surrendering their grip on reality. The more they listened, the more the voices drew them in. They had come to believe that these whispers were not mere figments of their collective paranoia, but something that knew them, something that had always been waiting for them. The investigation left more questions than answers, and as the family's tragic end was marked by a silence that seemed to stretch into eternity, it became clear that whatever had consumed them, whether by bloodline, madness, or something darker, remained hidden, buried deep within the walls they had once called home. As the investigation into the Harrington family's tragic downfall deepened, the authorities turned their attention to the land itself, ground that had once seemed as stable and innocent as any other plot of earth, but now, in hindsight, felt far more insidious. Long before the house had been built, before the Harringtons had ever arrived, the land had a history of unsettling events, stories whispered through generations, barely remembered yet undeniably present. The first traces of something amiss were found in a set of old town records, their pages brittle with age. The documents spoke of a series of disappearances and deaths that spanned decades, reaching back to the early 1700s. At first, these stories appeared to be little more than accidents, misfortune that befell the scattered inhabitants of a sparsely settled region. But as the investigators dug deeper, the pattern began to emerge. A disturbing number of those who had lived on the land were reported to have vanished without explanation, their bodies never recovered. Others had been found dead under strange circumstances, their causes of death listed as suicides or unnatural causes, but with no clear evidence to support such claims. Most telling of all, however, were the accounts of a series of ritualistic deaths. The records contained vague references to ceremonies performed by the town's earliest settlers, events that were said to take place at the very site where the Harrington house would later be built. These ceremonies, never fully documented, were believed to have been connected to a mysterious cult, one that had worshipped something older than the land itself, something dark and unyielding. Though the details were scarce, it was clear that the people who had lived here before the Harringtons had been drawn into something far beyond their understanding. The more the investigators unearthed, the more it seemed as though the house and the land beneath it had been a focal point of torment for centuries. Whispers had circulated about the curse placed upon the land, a curse that was said to make those who dwelt there hear voices and succumb to madness. These were no mere tales, the investigators realized. They were a warning. But it wasn't just the land itself. As they traced the family's history further, a troubling discovery was made. The Harringtons were not strangers to this place. A great-great-grandfather of the patriarch had been one of the original settlers, a man who had somehow managed to avoid the strange fate that befell so many others. Yet even he had been drawn into the web of secrecy that had shrouded the land. He had in fact been the one to oversee the construction of the house, though the records concerning his involvement were oddly sparse. It was as if the family had purposefully obscured his role in the house's origins. The deeper the authorities probed, the more evident it became that the Harrington family, though unaware, had unwittingly inherited not just the house, but the curse of the land itself. It seemed that the voices which had tormented them for so long had not simply emerged from the minds of the family, but were part of something older, something tied to the very earth upon which the house stood. On the final day of their investigation, the investigators stood in the study, the place where the voices had first been heard. The silence was unnerving, oppressive. It was as if the house at last had given up its secret, leaving only the faintest trace of its terrible past. The land had claimed the family, just as it had claimed those before them. What had begun as whispers had become a slow, inevitable pulling force, a presence in the walls that had only grown stronger with time. The voices were not born of the house. They had come long before, and now they would never be silenced. As the investigation into the tragic end of the Harrington family concluded, the full extent of their fate began to take shape in a way that left an unsettling sense of inevitability. The family, once thought to be isolated in their suffering, were in truth caught in a far darker legacy, a history that had been buried deep, not just in the family's past, but in the very land they had inhabited. The family's psychological breakdowns had not been the result of mere mental illness or external pressures, as many had first assumed. These were not isolated incidents, nor was the terror they had experienced limited to their home. The whispers, the growing paranoia, the silent withdrawal, they were symptoms of something far older, something that had slowly crept into the very fabric of their being. It had been passed down through generations, a silent inheritance that had shaped their lives without them ever understanding its true nature. As the investigators pieced together the scattered fragments of the family's history, a chilling pattern emerged. It was clear that each member of the family had suffered in some way from the same affliction. The patriarch's grandfather had been the first to experience the whispers, though he had never spoken of them openly. The family's own archives were filled with cryptic references to those who had gone before, and the many records of mental instability, but few of them were conclusive. They were barely acknowledged, as if the family had attempted to bury the truth beneath layers of silence. The mental deterioration was not simply a result of isolation, it was part of the family's tragic fate, an inheritance they could not escape. The house, once thought to be the source of the family's affliction, was only a symptom of a much larger, more insidious force. The land itself seemed to have been saturated with this curse, the very soil soaked when the weight of past tragedies. The voices, once thought to be figments of the family's decaying minds, were now recognized as something else entirely, an ancient, malevolent presence, perhaps tied to the original settlers of the land, whose whispers had carried through the centuries. What the family had experienced in their final days was not a moment of madness, but the culmination of years of influence, the final act in a tragedy that had been written long before they were born. As the investigation drew to a close, there was little left to say. The Harrington family had become an unavoidable part of the land's history, bound to it in a way that could not be undone. The house remained empty, but its oppressive silence was a reminder of what had occurred within its walls. The voices, though no longer heard by any living member, lingered in the air like a faint hum, never fully gone. What would become of the house now? Would the voices fade into nothingness, or would they remain, waiting for the next family to fall victim to their pull? The investigators could not say for certain. The land, it seemed, had its own way of holding on to its past, and as for the Harrington family, their tragic legacy would not be forgotten. It was a story that had begun long before them, and it would continue, echoing through the years, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The house stands at the edge of the town, abandoned now, though its influence lingers in the quiet that surrounds it. Years have passed since the last of the Harringtons were carried away, and the house, once so full of life, has been left to decay in silence. Attempts to demolish it have failed. Workers who came with the intent to tear it down left with no explanation, their tools abandoned, their faces ashen, as though the house itself had forced them to retreat. No one in the town dares approach the place anymore. It sits still and brooding as though waiting for something. The windows, once grand and open to the light, are now boarded tightly, each board secured with nails driven deep into the wood. The doors, which had once welcomed guests and sheltered the family, are locked, their hinges rusted with age. But even with these efforts to secure it, the house remains a presence in the town. It is not the physical structure that unnerves those who come near, but something far subtler, something that presses against the air itself, clinging to the space surrounding it. The silence of the house is louder than any sound could ever be, as though it carries the weight of years of suffering and silence, an echo of the voices that once filled the rooms. Locals speak of a stillness that has become unbearable, a presence in the air that settles over the ground like fog. The house is empty now, but its emptiness is a living thing, more powerful than any of the spirits that might have once haunted its halls. It's as if the house mourns its lost inhabitants, its lost voices, though no one alive has ever truly understood what that means. The air around the house remains thick with an oppressive weight, as though the ground itself feels the family's absence. The whispers that once plagued the Harringtons, faint at first, have become louder in their absence, and some claim to hear them still, drifting from the windows that no one dares to open. There is one room, in particular, that draws the most attention: the study. Though it has been sealed for years, there is an odd heaviness that surrounds it. No one has dared to enter it in years, yet some say that on still nights they hear faint sounds coming from behind the boarded-up door, the soft scrape of something moving, a slight shuffle, as if something is pacing, trapped within. The house may be empty, but the study remains, as if waiting for something to return. And there are those who claim that in the quiet, just beyond the veil of silence, something watches. Perhaps it is the house itself, or perhaps it is the very ghosts of those who have passed. But whatever it is not a peaceable thing. The house mourns, yes, but it does so in a way that unsettles the living, as if it knows something they do not, something that it will never reveal. In time, the house will continue to decay, just as the memories of the family who once lived there have begun to fade, but its silence, heavy and enduring, will remain. It will remain, waiting for something, or perhaps it will simply wait forever. In the final days of the investigation, the weight of the house's lingering silence seemed to deepen. For months, the authorities had combed through every possible lead, tracing the origins of the voices that had tormented the family. It had been a hunt for something tangible, a haunting force, something otherworldly that had seeped into the very bones of the house. But the truth, when it finally came, was not what they had expected. The house, with all its eerie, decaying grandeur, had not been the source of the whispers, nor had the land been cursed, as some had suggested. No, the voices were never external at all. They had been inside the family all along. As the final pieces of the investigation fell into place, it became clear that the family's tragic fate had been one of their own making. Years of isolation, combined with a long history of mental illness and repressed trauma, had created a shared delusion, a madness passed from one generation to the next. The voices, once thought to come from the walls, the house, or the land, had been the product of the family's own fractured minds, collective hallucinations, born from their deepening despair. The patriarch, once a man of reason, had begun his descent into madness long before the whispers first reached his ears. His journals, painstakingly examined, revealed the slow but steady erosion of his sanity. At first, the voices had been faint, almost imperceptible, easily dismissed. But as the months wore on and his mind began to unravel, they became clearer, more insistent. He had responded to them, not as a man of sound mind, but as someone driven by a compulsion he could neither understand nor control. The wife, too, had not been immune. Her retreat into silence, her fixation on corners and unseen things, had not been born from the house's malevolent influence, but from her own psychological collapse. She had become as much a prisoner of the voices as her husband, and like him, had become consumed by them, unable to differentiate between reality and the delusions her mind had created. The children, perhaps the most vulnerable, had absorbed the same affliction. Their withdrawal from the outside world, their vacant stares, had been symptoms of a mind unable to function under the strain of their inherited madness. The voices had never been outside of them. They had always been there, inside their heads, festering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to surface. It was the isolation, the years of fear and internalized trauma that had allowed them to grow loud enough to be heard. The final truth, though clear, was no less terrifying. The family's descent had not been caused by an external force, but by their own minds. The tragedy of the Harringtons stood as a chilling reminder of the fragility of the human psyche, and how, when pushed beyond its limits, the mind could fracture and take everything around it with it. The house was not a place of haunting. It was merely a cage, a witness to the breakdown of its inhabitants. And now, as the investigation ended, it stood empty once more, its silence holding the last remnants of a family's unravelling, waiting for another chapter that would never come. As the final whispers of the Harrington family fade into the silence of history, we are left with more questions than answers. The house, now abandoned, holds its secrets tightly, its walls still echoing with the voices that once plagued its inhabitants. What drove a once proud family to descend into madness? Was it a curse from the land itself, or something far darker? The truth, buried in fragmented records and the lingering silence of a forsaken home, may never be fully understood. But the story doesn't end here. The legacy of the Harringtons serves as a chilling reminder of the fragility of the mind and the forces that shape our realities, for better or worse. If you found this story haunting, and if you seek to uncover more hidden truths buried in time,